Man of Sword, which is the peated smoky version of our whiskey.
Yeah, that's interesting, and something I noticed when I was researching and writing up the distillery that so you're producing equal quantities of peated and unpeated whiskey.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
And do you split that sort of like 6 monthly down the line, so the equipment sort of just runs peated for 6 months, and then, or do you switch it on a different timescale?
So we switch it. So essentially what we end up doing is, so January would be for example, our unpeated month, so the Man of Words. We will do 30 tons of barley. We'll make 2.5 tons a day of grist. We'll use that. And then once January is finished, we clean out all of our equipment. We then swap to February, which is then the Man of Sword. And then we do March, April, May, June, and we split it equally that way. So at the spirit level, between filling, they're only about a month apart. So essentially, that's how we can narrow down that quality when we want to release something in tandem. So if it's a specialist cask like a red wine, tequila, or rum cask, because we fill them pretty much at the same time, but they'll be maturing at the same time. So when we're ready to release them, the Man of Words should be completed as well as the Man of Swords, and we'll release them together.
It's interesting. I don't think there's many distilleries that are kind of doing that even split between peated and unpeated. Obviously, quite a few distilleries that don't typically peat, and then they do like a week or two of it, and then you get some distilleries that do some occasional unpeated expressions. But to kind of split the eggs between two baskets evenly, so to speak, is unusual.
Yeah, our production team have a massive job on their hands, put it that way. So we're quite big on cross contamination and quite big on cleanliness as well, especially with the COVID situation that just happened. So when we're doing fermentation, we have 6 washbacks. We'll steam clean them, 10 times each and every time that they get transferred from month to month, regardless if it's peated or if it's unpeated, just to make sure that there is minimalistic cross contamination amongst all of our spirit.
Nice. And your location, you are right near the border, aren't you? Like you're what, like 5 minutes from the English border? Is that about right?
Yeah, we are indeed. So the way I explain it to people is, has anyone ever heard of Carlisle? They go, yes, of course. I say, have you ever heard of Gretna Green, where everybody runs away to get married to? They say, yes, no problem. And I said, well, once they've made that mistake, they sort of have to come to our distillery for some light refreshments and a nice healthy dosage of alcohol. So we are the first distillery in Scotland, and depending on which way you look at it, they're also last distillery in Scotland as well.
Nice. Right, we'll get on to tasting in a sec. So talking about this whiskey, so like we say, we bought an entire sherry butt off you basically. So this isn't something that you're selling as such, yourselves. However, you do obviously bottle lots of unpeated whiskey in sherry casks. So there's similar stuff available from you as well. So do you want to talk a little bit about, so the distinction is it Man of Words and Man of Swords, right?
That's correct, yes. So Man of Words is unpeated. That's dedicated to Robert Burns, hence the quilt on the bottle. And then you've got the Man of Sword, which is the peated smoky version of a whiskey, and that's dedicated to Robert the Bruce, hence the sword on the bottle as well.
Yeah, cool. And you've got some uncut. Mine's at 50. Ours is all at 50%. So I'm going to pour some out now. We'll have a little taste. And we're going to bring Serge from Four Roses in as well, because he's got it. And it's interesting to get his opinion on it too.
Fantastic.
So do you want to just talk us through sort of roughly what we should be smelling and tasting? And no doubt our audience will throw out some tasting notes as well, as they often do.
Of course. So the thing I always do is, there's Serge. You all right?
Yes, how's it going? All good?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I was getting ahead of myself there.
Go for it, Ben.
So as you see on the colour, because we always take note of the colour before we do anything. So I would always classify this as that sort of light, rich cherry sort of note. So it's not quite the haystack that people are accustomed to with bourbon whiskies we'll see at the Four Roses. And then what I normally get on the nose is it's always going to be sweet. Annandale Distillery overall characteristic was always going to be light and fruity, as I've already mentioned, because when it's unpeated, then we love a sweet whiskey. We sort of get notes of honey and a little bit of toffee, actually. There's not a lot of European oak spice, I would say. That's something that I don't normally get on this. It tends to be more creamy and more vanilla-y. But mine's a little bit more thicker than yours, as the ones are uncut, so maybe that's just me.
Cut it with some saliva when it gets in your mouth.
And then it's sort of, as you peel away from it, It sometimes comes into that summer tropical fruits, a little bit of melon with a little bit of mango. So a little bit of a sort of a dryness as well.
I really think it's a sweet shop whiskey. There's a lot of candy characteristics in there. You know, like, I don't know, I'm thinking like Haribo type things, cherry sweets and all that sort of stuff coming through for me.
I get an almost like, I guess the best way I can describe it is a very summery, almost like a melon sweetness and rich fruitiness in there.
With the palate, with Oloroso, you're never going to be stuck for flavour.
Yeah.
The actual problem with Oloroso is that you've got to sometimes try and tame that flavour. So how do we do that? Do we wait for it to be older? Do we release it straight away? I think we've hit the right combination with it being about 5 years old, because it's a big sherry, but it's 500 litres, so it takes a little bit longer to mature than a bourbon cask. And I think we've sort of hit the nail on the head. So we tend to get that plum and dry raisin note, which is always going to be prevalent with Oloroso sherry casks.
I think another good way of taming sherry is strength. You know, if you cut it too low in ABV, then it gets a bit flabby and like too sort of sherry dominant. Whereas as you keep that ABV high, then you get spice and dryness that balances some of the sweetness from the sherry cask.
Yeah. So I'm just going to add a little bit of water to mine just to take it down a touch. And what's interesting about Annandale, as I've already mentioned, is that we do single malt, single cask, and cask strength. Well, why do we decide to keep it at cask strength? Well, essentially because we didn't want to mass produce anything. So what that means is by keeping it single cask, it all comes from one cask. All the bottles are from a specific cask, of course. No problems. Enough said on that. But by keeping it at cask strength, it keeps the bottle quantity low. And by doing that, it means that it's a lot more sought after, should we say. You tend to appreciate a bottle a bit more that it's kept at cask strength, I believe, because, well, mine's 57.9%. And if anybody's knocking back 57.9% whiskey by the drams, they're not going to have much left, and they'll probably be on the floor. So,
well, I just think it gives you greater freedom to enjoy it, right? If you want to drink a 57, you can. If you want to drink it 40, you can. If you want to drink it, whatever strength you like, at least you have the option, right? Whereas if it's 40, some of that optionality has been taken away from you, hasn't it?
Yeah, I always say that to anyone who tries our whiskey. I travel around the country giving it to people and testing it and seeing what they think of it and giving their personal opinion. And it's always a case of, I always say advice, if you've got a single cask or cask strength bottle at home, just take 1 dram out of it. Could be big, could be small, and just see where the rabbit hole goes. Just keep adding water to that dram, and eventually yourself will hit a certain spot of ABV, which is right for yourself. And once you hit that spot, you'll probably never go back to drinking it any other way, which is fantastic, which is the way it was always meant to be, I suppose.
Cool. Right. Serge, you're up, mate. Let's talk about Four Roses. I think that's your missus saying hello as well, which isn't. So we'll put that up there. And over to you, mate. So I know you. We used to work together, in fact. Quite a few years
not at the whiskey bar, but 2 levels above it.
Yeah, 2 levels above it. Yeah. And I know that you are a lover of spirits generally, especially rum. But you've landed yourself a prize gig here, looking after Four Roses, which, in my mind, is one of the better Kentucky bourbon distilleries. It's got some very interesting stories around it in terms of those.
In my mind too.
Yeah. So we've got 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm going to sort of hand it over to you, because I think probably the best thing to do here is to maybe sort of distinguish what sets Four Roses apart from the rest of the Kentucky set.
Yeah, so very, very, very briefly, because there's quite a bit of history behind Four Roses as well. You know, we've heard about the fantastic history behind the Annandale distillery. So Four Roses goes back to 1888 with Paul Jones Jr., the company founder, starting his company originally in Atlanta, and then Georgia enacted Prohibition about 2 decades before the rest of the country, even 3 decades before the rest of the country in 1890. So they ended up moving to Kentucky. And then in 1912, he founded the company that would become Four Roses as we know it today. And, you know, over Prohibition, it was one of the few companies that kept a distilling license. There were only 6 of them, and you needed a medical prescription, although you could get it for absolutely ridiculous reasons. One of my favorite was you could get an ounce of whiskey prescribed every hour for an upset stomach. Absolutely, sure. So yeah, it was one of the distilleries operating during Prohibition, which set it up really well once Prohibition ended, and by the 40s it became the biggest bourbon in the US. There's that very, very famous picture. I have it somewhere. There's a very famous picture of of a sailor and a nurse kissing at the end of the Second World War, which is at Times Square. But if you we normally just see the zoomed in picture, but in the zoomed out picture, you can see a Four Roses advertisement on top of Times Square. So this at the very top of Times Square here, you can see there was a Four Roses ad, and it kind of shows up on the picture as well. I don't know if it's going to be sharp enough, but yeah, there at the top, that's Four Roses.
Ah, nice.
So it was pretty much the biggest bourbon in sort of mid 20th century US, and that led to it being bought by Seagram's. The Canadian spirits giant. They've had a lot of Canadian whiskey, and sort of Seagram's over the years turned Four Roses into a Canadian style blended whiskey. It was blended in 5 different distilleries, which will be important later on. But the quality of the brand in the US didn't necessarily stay the same as it was before. Now, interestingly, for the export market, particularly for Europe and Japan, where it was very popular, they kept it the same. They kept it the original bourbon. And so when Seagram's jumped out of the spirits business in 2002, Kirin, a Japanese company, ended up buying Four Roses and sort of restoring it to this traditional bourbon style. And I mentioned the 5 distilleries that Seagram's was using was important. That's because they used 5 different yeasts, and they also used several mash bills. So today, Four Roses keeps 2 of those mash bills. So we have 2 different mash bills, and we have 5 different yeasts. We kept each of the yeasts. And so in effect, Four Roses makes 10 different bourbons. When you look at a lot of the sort of the bigger bourbon companies, they tend to have very much the same starting recipe, and then it's the aging and the ABV and the warehouse positioning that is the difference between its various labels and its various expressions. That's not what we do at Four Roses. So we've got 2 mash bills. We've got our high corn mash bill, which is 75 corn, 20 rye, and 5% malted barley. So we just use a bit of malted barley to help kickstart the ferment. And then we have our high rye, which is 60 corn, 35 rye, and 5% malted barley. So again, 20% even in the lower one is very high rye content. It's very much a high rye bourbon. And then the high rye mash is just crazy. And then we ferment each of them with our 5 yeasts. So we have our what we call a light fruit, rich fruit, spice, floral, and herbaceous yeast. So in effect, we make 10 different bourbons. And then the other unique aspect of Four Roses is that we single rack all of our houses. So whereas the standard in most bourbons is that you're looking at 5-6 racks of barrels on top of each other with massive fluctuations in temperature, you have a lot less of that with Four Roses, which means we have more control over the final product. It also means that it's more distillate driven, not necessarily always that big barrel monster, which is it's not better or worse than other American whiskeys. It's the house style. It's how Four Roses prefers it. I'm a big fan of that. I'm again, as Tristan mentioned, I come from a rum background, so having all these different recipes and then having a more distillate driven whiskey is something that I very much appreciate. But yeah, I guess the use of these different recipes and the single rack warehousing are quite unique to Four Roses, especially among big mainstream brands. I can't really think of another one that does anything quite similar.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, most differentiation you get with other bourbon distilleries tends to be around warehouse placement in the cask. It makes a huge difference, temperature difference and humidity or how much alcohol vapors in the air as to what comes out of the cask at the end, and everything else is controlled for. It's the same. Four Roses sort of flips it on its head, doesn't it? So it's like we're going to control for warehouse conditions, but we're going to create differences within the distillate, and that's done at the time of fermentation and mashing. So 2 different mash bills, 5 different yeasts, 10 different bourbons. and that's enough to be dealing with. You don't need
yeah, for sure.
But I think this is one of the things that makes small batch kind of cool, because small batch, which is what we're tasting now, I believe is it 4 casks? It's a blend of.
So the way it works with the small batch, I think there's a slight confusion there with what people know, because we also have what we call our small batch limited edition or limited edition small batch. Now that is every year is a mix of 4 barrels. With the actual small batch, we do keep the batches to maximum 18 barrels. So we're still talking about a much smaller batch than a lot of other companies who just slap small batch as a label on everything. But yeah, 17, maximum 18 barrels. And it's both mashes. So you've got both the high rye and the high corn mash. And then it's the light fruit yeast. So the light fruit is the only consistent yeast we have in pretty much every whiskey we release. And then the spice yeast. So with the spice yeast, so with the light fruit, I always get lots of stone fruit. So you're getting lots of apricot and peach. And then some nice desserty notes, a bit of creme brulee, a bit of chocolate, a bit of cherry. And then with the spice yeast, you're very much talking about that classic baking spice flavor. So, cloves, cinnamon. And this is the one I feel is out of the regular portfolio, so from the original small batch single barrel, this is the one that's closest to a classically styled American whiskey. So this is very much your, for your old fashions and other kinds of drinks. It shows a fair bit of barrel influence because the spice yeast is so important. That plays really well with the vanilla and the caramel from the cask.
You got a bit there to taste as well, haven't you, Ben? So, and we're getting some tasting notes coming through as well from our viewers. What we got here? Burnt grass and butter.
It's very buttery. I think anything anything with sufficient amount of corn, you will always get that nice buttery flavor.
I don't know if it means cannabis or like lawn. I'm not sure, but
I think everyone's just smelling the outside right now. If they're smelling burnt grass, that's just all of the UK.
I think sometimes
that tasting note was not finished. Then goes so smooth as you drink it. Woodlands honey, bit 24-hour toasted oats with fruit. I don't understand that. That sounds like a honey bit 24. Is that a brand of toasted oats? 24HR? I don't know. Phil, you're gonna have to.
Maybe it's like overnight oats. I don't know.
Oh yeah, 24-hour toasted oats. Yeah, that'd be it. Yeah, overnight. Yeah. Nice. What about you, Ben? What are you thinking?
Well, from my perspective, I'd find it hard to find a bourbon that you don't like, put it that way, because it's really, really nice to sort of find where Scotland gets its casks from anyway. So if you can think of it like, who doesn't love vanilla? Very little people. You're gonna be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't love vanilla. And then when you get a brand like Four Roses that is doing it differently in their sort of unique way, and it adds that interesting characteristic and aspect to it, you'd be hard pressed not to enjoy this.
Yeah, I think bourbon in the past has sort of fallen a bit victim to sort of regulation and production protocol, and it's been difficult to tell bourbons apart a lot. But what I will say is that there are some great bourbons. Well, the traditional Kentucky set are now starting to produce bourbons a little bit more out of their own wheelhouse, a little bit more innovative products. And obviously there's distilleries all over the US producing bourbon whiskey as well. But I do think products like this, and what's the other one called, Serge? The small batch special edition, is it? Or...
the small batch select. So the small batch select, we released that in the UK at the end of last year. It's currently only in 30 states in the US and the UK and nowhere else. So the difference between the one that you're drinking and that one is, well, first off, there's an extra 7%, so that's 52%. And we add the herbaceous yeast. So it's a mix of 6 whiskeys rather than 4. Again, all 3 yeasts get fermented with both mashes. It's similar to this one, but it tastes even more like a bottled julep already because of the herbaceous yeast gives you sort of that nice spearmint and oregano flavor. So yeah, it makes for a very naughty julep.
Nice.
So yeah, and then we've got the original, which is the I keep getting confused by my camera angle. So yeah, we've got the original, which is a mix of all 10, which is pretty crazy. And then the single barrel, which is only the high rye mash and the light fruit yeast. So this that's my personal favorite from the lineup, because you have that massive fruit note coming from the yeast, and then that really, really peppery, spicy flavor from the high rye.
Yeah, I remember I was at the distillery years ago. Oh god, like 8 years ago, and I forget what's the name of the former master distiller at Four Roses.
Jim Rutledge.
Jim Rutledge, yeah. So I was chatting with him in his office, and he'd sort of taken us round, me and my photographer I was with, because I was doing the first whiskey book, and he was taking us around the distillery and obviously talking through what you've just talked through so eloquently, all the yeast stuff and the mash stuff and the warehousing. And then we sat down in his office and sort of got in a bit more detail about these yeasts and what they were doing and the sort of flavor profiles and everything, and that tied into the history. And then he produced this bottle of a small batch that they'd done, I think probably back in, like, I would say 2010. And it was a marriage of, a handful of casks, maybe 4, maybe, I don't know, something like that. And there'd been this specific yeast that one of the 5 that they'd distilled 5 years previously, so let's say 2005, and through some kind of magic or whatever, it was the wood on the cask or the particular placement in the warehouse or just that particular ferment, maybe the temperature of it was virulent in some way or another. It shot out some kind of esters or whatever. It just produced this bourbon that was insane. And he reckons it's the best bourbon that he'd ever made and the best bourbon he'd ever tasted. And was like, if you could capture what that yeast was doing on that day and capture all those sort of maturation conditions and then just start a distillery and replicate it all every single day, you'd be making the best bourbon anyone's ever tasted. But you can't.
I remember reading this in your book, because I was using your book as one of the things I did when I was prepping for my interview. So
it all goes full circle in the end. Yeah. But yeah, I was kind of, it's one of the sort of stories from distillers that always sticks with me. It's like, wow, he managed to taste that thing, and I guess part of the sort of the value of it was that he knew, well, I can't do it again. It's done. Like, it was all done years ago. Like, how do you replicate that? You can look at the logbook and see how you made it, but you're never going to quite get there again.
Yeah.
There's too many other factors at work. Pretty cool. Anyway, I ended up rambling on a little bit there. Let's get one more. We got Phil Fraser's really dishing out the tasting notes tonight, so let's just continue with him since we're not getting a lot from anyone else. Lovely creamy end with spice, lightly tingling the edge of the tongue. First ever try at Four Roses, fantastic. We'll try again, definitely.
Good call. Great call, Phil.
Question for you there, Serge. Where can we get the Select in the UK?
Whisky Exchange across the UK, and then Jerry's specifically in London, or any Whisky Exchange shop. But yeah, Whisky Exchange has a fair bit of stock left. We should have this year's stock coming in the next few months as well. But there's a few hundred bottles left.
How much? What's the sort of RRP on that?
It's 60 quid. It's pretty well priced.
Yeah.
All of them are surprisingly affordable. Sorry?
Yeah, but bourbon, everything's affordable. Like, compared to Scotch, you're like, oh God, really? That's like one of the best things you make, and it's 60 quid. No offense, Ben, but you know what I'm talking about.
That's right.
Cool. All right, look, guys, that was fun. Appreciate your time, and we managed to keep the noise of fans blowing in faces and all that sort of stuff down, which is impressive. Everyone's sweating, like, I don't know. So we'll let everyone go, but that was really enjoyable. Great whiskies.
Right.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
All right. Cheers and good night.